We're all taught this one thing from day one in business. Competition is good. It's the engine of capitalism, right? The heart of the free market. But what if that's a lie? What if the thing we celebrate most, competition, is actually the biggest reason most businesses fail? That's the pretty wild idea we're digging into today.
So let's start with a question that really gets to the core of this. What important truth do very few people agree with you on? It's a fantastic way to challenge your own thinking. And in the world of business, the most important and maybe the most dangerous contrarian truth is the one we hold most sacred, the idea that competition is everything.
I mean, think back to any Econ 101 class you might have taken. You learn that competition is the ideal state for a market. It's what drives prices down and quality up. We talk about it like it's this noble virtue, a kind of business Olympics where the best company wins. But the real question is, does anyone actually win?
Well, this is the textbook ideal, perfect competition. It's basically a market where every single company is selling the same thing. They're all just commodities. And the brutal, cold reality of this model is that any little bit of profit is like blood in the water. New companies rush in, prices get slashed, and margins get thinner and thinner until nobody is making any real money. It's not a race to the top, it's a frantic, desperate race to the bottom.
Okay, for a real-world example of this, let's just look at the airlines. I mean, they provide a massive service, right? They fly millions of people around, creating huge value for society. They are the textbook example of a brutally competitive industry. So you'd think they'd be incredibly valuable companies, wouldn't you?
Well, check this out. In 2012, the average airline made just 37 cents of profit for every passenger they flew. 37 cents. Just think about that for a second. All that incredible infrastructure, all that value created for you and me and the companies themselves, they captured almost none of it. That is the grim reality when the only tool you have to compete with is a lower price.
So if competition just leads to this brutal struggle for survival, what's the alternative? Well, the argument we're exploring is that the real goal isn't to win the competition, it's to escape it completely. The goal is to build a monopoly.
Now, before you start thinking of old-school, mustache-twirling robber barons, hold on. We're talking about a creative monopoly. This isn't about crushing your rivals with shady tactics. It's about creating something so new and so much better that you literally have no real competitors. You're in a league of your own. And to really see the power of this idea, let's go back to that same year, 2012, and compare the airlines to Google. Now, by the numbers, the airline industry actually created far more total economic value. But the story of who got to keep that value, well, that couldn't be more different.
And wow, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? Just look at that difference. Over on the left, you've got Google with a profit margin of over 21%. And on the right, the entire airline industry. You can barely even see the bar. Google's margin was more than 100 times bigger. That's the incredible power of owning a market versus just competing in one.
So this gets us to the kind of mind-bending conclusion here. Capitalism is all about accumulating capital, right? Making profit. But perfect competition, it competes all that profit away. The lesson is crystal clear. If you want to build a truly valuable, lasting company, you have to escape that commodity trap.
Okay, so if this is all true, why isn't it common knowledge? Why isn't this what they teach you in business school? Well, it turns out that both sides, the monopolists and the competitors, have a really strong reason to hide the truth about where they stand.
It's this weird game of smoke and mirrors. The monopolists, they are terrified of getting scrutinized by regulators, so they do everything they can to pretend they're in a knockdown, drag-out fight. And at the same time, the companies that are actually in that fight, well, they need to attract investors and good employees, so they puff out their chests and pretend they're totally unique.
And this table here breaks down the two big lies perfectly. A monopolist, to make itself look smaller, defines its market as broadly as possible, the union of a bunch of huge markets. So Google will say, oh, us? We're not just in search, we're in the massive global advertising market. The competitor, though, does the exact opposite. They define their market as this tiny little intersection of niches to make themselves seem totally unique and dominant.
And here is the monopolist's lie in action. We all know Google has a massive monopoly on search. But when they're under pressure, they say, whoa, wait a second, we're just a tiny player in the almost $500 billion global advertising market. See what they did there? By framing it that way, they look like a little fish in a giant pond. And here's the flip side, the competitor's lie. So you want to open a restaurant. You tell yourself and you tell your investors, we'll be the only British food restaurant in all of Palo Alto. You've defined your market so narrowly that you sound unique. But the reality, you're competing with every single other restaurant in town.
That's the trap. You ignore the real competition, and that's why so many small businesses end up failing.
You know, this obsession with competition, it goes way beyond just business strategy. It's almost an ideology. It shapes how we think, and it pushes us into these battles that are often totally pointless and just destructive.
It's funny, Shakespeare totally nailed this. The most bitter feuds aren't between total opposites. They're between rivals who are almost identical. The Montagues and the Capulets, they were alike in dignity, and that's precisely why they hated each other. In business, that same dynamic leads companies to become obsessed with each other, instead of being obsessed with creating something new. The war between Microsoft and Google in the 2000s is just a perfect, tragic example of this. As you can see on this timeline, they started out in totally separate worlds, but then they became obsessed. It was Windows versus Chrome OS, Bing versus Google Search. They poured billions into just copying and attacking each other's turf. And while they were locked in this epic battle, staring each other down, what happened? Apple came out of left field and changed the entire game with mobile, leaving them both scrambling to catch up.
And that's really the ultimate lesson here. Yeah, winning's better than losing. But everybody loses when the war isn't even worth fighting in the first place. Rivalry just makes you copy the past. It stops you from inventing the future.
Okay, so if competition is a trap, how do you escape it? The answer really lies in a completely different way of thinking about progress itself.
It really boils down to two types of progress. There's horizontal progress, or 1 to N, which is basically copying things that already work. The simple word for that is globalization. But then there's vertical progress, or 0 to 1, and that is about creating something brand new. The word for that is technology. And those creative monopolies, they are always built on a 0 to 1 leap.
See, after the dot-com crash back in 2000, Silicon Valley learned a set of lessons that became absolute dogma. Be humble, take small, incremental steps, iterate, improve on what a competitor is already doing. Basically just avoid the big, bold visions that got everyone into trouble in the first place.
But what if the exact opposite principles are actually more true? That it's better to risk being bold than to be trivial. That a bad plan is actually better than no plan at all. That competitive markets are for losers. And that sales matters every bit as much as your product. To really build the future, you kind of have to unlearn the lessons of the past.
And all this brings us to our final thought, which is a brilliant twist on that famous line from Tolstoy. All happy companies are different. Each one earns a monopoly by solving a unique problem. All failed companies are the same. They failed to escape competition. So the ultimate question for anyone building something new isn't how you're going to win. It's how are you going to be different?